At 10:47 on the worst night of a January that had already done its best to bury our entire street, my neighbor knocked on my door and said her car was stuck in the snow. By 11:30, the car was unstuck. She hadn't moved toward her door. Instead, she opened her coat, reached into each pocket, and produced 2 cans of Rainier she'd carried from her apartment. She was wearing flannel pajamas underneath the coat, green plaid, wool socks. She smiled at me with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting all night for me to figure something out. That wasn't an accident. Her smile made that very clear. My name is Jasper Holt. I was 29 that winter, working as a building inspector for a county in the Oregon Coast Range, a job that required me to stand inside old structures and tell people what was slowly killing them. Cedar rot, foundation settling, water intrusion behind the walls that no one could see. I had developed a talent for spotting the things that looked fine from the outside, but weren't. I had apparently not applied that skill to my own life. The apartment complex where I lived had 4 units arranged around a covered walkway, a converted Victorian that someone in the 1980s had divided with the ambition of a developer and the carpentry skills of a bored teenager. My unit was number 2. Nina had moved into number 3, directly across the narrow walkway, the previous May. She was 27, a wildlife photographer who worked on contract for conservation non-props and nature publications. She'd come back from a 6-week assignment in the Cascades with a hiking pack the size of a small refrigerator and a camera bag she treated with more care than some people treat their children. I'd helped her carry the pack up the stairs. That was how we met. For 7 months, we had been doing the careful, friendly dance of 2 people who lived close enough to affect each other's lives without being invited to. She borrowed my WD-40. I borrowed her parking spot the 3 days mine was blocked by a contractor. We compared notes on the building's ancient furnace, which seemed to run on a schedule driven less by thermostat than by personal grievance. When her bathroom light died, she knocked and asked if I had a spare bulb. I did. We stood in her bathroom doorway for 40 minutes, talking about her last assignment, while the new bulb warmed up. I noticed her. Anyone would have. But I had a rule I had made myself after a relationship that ended badly enough to teach me something permanent. 2 years before that January, I had been 3 weeks from proposing to a woman named Gail. We'd been together for 2.5 years, had already picked out a neighborhood in Portland, and had the kind of comfortable pattern I'd mistaken for certainty. One of her friends threw a dinner party. By the end of it, I understood, in the specific way you understand things when you can't unknow them, that Gail and I had been making each other quietly miserable for at least a year, and had both been too polite to say so. We ended it without a scene. I kept the ring for 3 months in a sock drawer before I sold it. Not because I was sad, but because deciding what to do with it required knowing what I wanted next, and I didn't. What I landed on eventually was a rule. No relationships built on proximity and convenience. No dating the woman I'd have to see every morning if something went wrong. Living 12 feet from someone's front door seemed like a creative way to make that promise meaningless. So I helped Nina when she needed it. I talked to her on the covered walkway in the evenings when we were both coming home late. I found myself remembering, without meaning to, the small things she mentioned. That she took her coffee black, that she couldn't sleep during high-pressure weather systems because the silence made her restless, that she kept her best photograph, a gray wolf standing at the edge of a frozen lake in Yellowstone, as her phone lock screen, not because it was technically perfect, but because she'd waited 3 hours in 8-degree wind to get it, and it reminded her that patience worked. I did not act on any of it. I called that discipline. Then January buried us. A low-pressure system came in off the coast and dropped 14 inches of snow in 36 hours, which, for our part of Oregon, was the weather equivalent of a natural disaster. The county closed non-emergency inspections. I worked from home, reviewing reports, while the parking lot below our walkway turned into something geological. By the time the snow stopped late on a Tuesday night, every car in the lot had become a white shape that only approximately resembled a vehicle. At 10:47, someone knocked. Nina was standing in the doorway in a down coat, her dark hair loose, cheeks already flushed from the cold. She said her car was stuck and she had a job interview in the morning over video call and needed to plug in her equipment bag to charge overnight, and her power strip was in her car. And she'd tried to dig it out, but the snow was packed against the driver's side and she couldn't get the door open. I put on my boots. It took me 11 minutes. I kept a set of chains and a collapsible shovel in my truck bed out of professional habit. Inspecting old buildings in the Coast Range meant weather could strand you anywhere. I cleared the packed snow from her door, got her car open, retrieved the power strip, and handed it to her. She stood with it in both hands and looked at me. "Okay," I said, "you're good." She didn't move toward her door. Instead, she reached into the right pocket of her coat and produced a can of Rainier, then into the left pocket for a second one. She held one out. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Offering you a beer. It's 11:30 at night." The storm cleared. Look. She nodded toward the sky. I looked. The overcast had broken in the last hour, and the stars above the tree line were the particular sharp kind that only appeared when the air was cold enough to feel like a different atmosphere entirely. "My tailgate's clean," I said. "I know. I watched you sweep it off when you got your shovel out." I looked at her again. Green plaid flannel pajamas under the coat, wool socks inside her boots. She had not dressed to go outside. She had dressed to go across the walkway. The power strip, I understood then, had been the excuse. "You planned this," I said. She smiled. Not guilty, not embarrassed, just patient, like she'd been waiting all night for me to get there. "I plan to get a beer with my neighbor," she said, "before one of us does something stupid like let winter end without ever doing this." I should have had a better response. Instead, I took the beer. My truck tailgate, cleared of snow, was cold enough to matter through denim. Nina sat beside me with her boots on the bumper and her hands wrapped around her can. The parking lot was quiet, snow-covered cars, yellow lamplight at the edge of the lot. Above the roofline, Orion had moved to a position I recognized from late-night site inspections in remote areas, past the midpoint of the sky, tipping west. "You could have just knocked on my door," I said, "without the car scenario. I wasn't sure you'd say yes to just knocking." "I would have." She looked over at me. "Would you?" The honest answer sat there for a moment. "Probably." "That's less reassuring than you think." I drank my beer. It was cold enough to feel redundant. "How long have you been planning this?" "About as long as you've been pretending not to notice me." My breath made a small cloud in the air. "I notice you. You've noticed every way to not act on it." She wasn't unkind when she said it. Factual. "You're the most observant person I've ever met about everything except yourself." I thought about telling her that was unfair. I thought about it long enough to realize it wasn't. "I have a thing about neighbors," I said. "What kind of thing?" "A rule. About not starting something I'd have to see fail every morning." She considered that. "That's the most pessimistic version of hope I've ever heard." "It worked for 2 years. How's it working tonight?" I looked at her. Her cheeks were red from the cold. A strand of dark hair had come across her face, and she hadn't moved it. She was watching me with the same stillness she'd described once when she talked about waiting for wildlife, the ability to go quiet enough that the world forgot you were watching. "Less well," I said. She laughed. Not at me. More like something she'd been holding came loose. She bumped her shoulder into mine and we sat that way for a while, shoulders touching, watching cold vapor rise off the snow. She'd been on 4 continents for work in 3 years, she told me. The kind of schedule that made friendships logistical and relationships nearly impossible. She'd had one serious relationship in her early 20s with someone she'd met at a photography workshop. He wanted a life in one city. She wasn't able to give it to him then, and she knew it, and ending it had been one of the clearest decisions she'd ever made, and still one of the harder ones. "What about now?" I asked. She wrapped both hands tighter around the can. "Now I'm not sure what I want it to look like. I love the work. I'm just not sure the work should be the whole answer." "Why not?" She looked at the sky for a moment. "Because I've gotten very good at being alone in beautiful places, and I'm starting to wonder if that's actually something to be proud of. Something in that landed differently than I expected. I told her about Gail. Not all of it, not the details that didn't matter anymore, but the essential shape. 2.5 years. The slow, polite collapse, the ring in the sock drawer. What did you do with it? She asked. Sold it. What did you buy? A better set of inspection tools. She made a sound like she was trying not to laugh and not entirely succeeding. That is extremely on brand for you. I bought good ones. I'm sure you did. She set her empty can on the tailgate beside her. So you made yourself a rule. I made myself a rule. And you've been watching me from across a 12-foot walkway for 7 months. Observing. Right. She turned toward me. And tonight, I came over in my pajamas, and now we're sitting on your tailgate in 14 inches of snow, and I'm asking you to tell me whether this was a terrible idea. She wasn't performing anything. She was tired of waiting, was what she was, and she was letting me see that, and it cost her something to do it. It was a great idea, I said. Something in her shoulders came down. Okay. But I have a question. I paused. You mentioned your landlord earlier, 30-day notice. A beat. Yeah. Why are you giving notice? The quiet that followed was different from the comfortable quiet we'd been sitting in. Nina set both feet flat on the bumper and looked toward the far end of the parking lot. I got offered a contract, she said. Juneau, Alaska. A conservation group documenting calving glaciers before the next major retreat. 8 months of fieldwork, starting in 6 weeks. Alaska. I did the geography without meaning to. 1,800 miles, a time zone behind, 8 months of fieldwork in one of the most remote and weather-complicated environments on the continent. That's incredible, I said. Yeah. You should take it. The words came out before I heard them clearly. Nina went very still beside me. After a moment, she reached for her empty can and turned it once in her hands. Right, she said. Her voice had leveled into something careful. I didn't mean. No, you're right. She hopped down from the tailgate. It's a great opportunity. Nina. I should get inside. It's cold and I have to charge all my equipment. She pulled her coat tighter. Thanks for the car and the company. I watched her walk back across the parking lot without looking back. I sat on the tailgate for 20 more minutes. It was cold enough that I stopped feeling my toes around. Mine at 11. I deserved it. The thing was, I hadn't been wrong about what I said. Juneau was genuinely an extraordinary opportunity. Glacier documentation at that scale, with that kind of funding, was the work people in her field spent a decade chasing. I believed every word. I had just reached for it before I was willing to say anything true, and she had heard exactly what it meant. That, when the moment came, I used her best options against myself to avoid risking anything. She had come across the walkway in her pajamas in January in 14 inches of snow. That was not an ambiguous signal. I went inside. I didn't sleep. At 7 in the morning, I made 2 coffees. I owned a good burr grinder and a pour-over setup that my brother called pretentious and that I called correct, and I made both cups the careful way, which took about 12 minutes. I knocked on Nina's door at 7:15. She answered in the same green plaid pajamas, a laptop open on the counter behind her, camera battery charging on the table. She looked at the coffees. She looked at me. I said what I actually thought before I said what I actually felt, I told her. And I said it to give myself somewhere to hide. She leaned against the doorframe. The truth is that you've been across that walkway for 7 months, and I've been finding very creative reasons not to do anything about it. And last night you drove through all of that, and I panicked and pushed you back out with a compliment about your job. You did. I don't want you to turn down something you've worked for because I said something honest 48 hours too late. But I also don't want to spend the next 8 months pretending last night didn't mean anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and tilted her head toward her kitchen. Your coffee better be good, she said. It was. She told me so twice, and I could tell both times she was annoyed at herself for it. We spent that day, and the next, and the one after that, doing what 2 people do when they have finally stopped waiting. I took her to the historic cannery building I'd been documenting for a county preservation grant. a massive, salt-bleached structure on the coast that was both falling apart and magnificent in ways that were hard to separate. She walked through every floor with her camera, not taking pictures of me or the work, just noticing. At the end, she said, "You love this one." She meant the building. She was right. She showed me her portfolio that evening, not the polished version on her website, but the working folder. Thousands of images organized by location and date, the ones that didn't quite work alongside the ones that did. The Yellowstone wolf, sandhill cranes landing in Nebraska, kelp forest in Monterey that looked painted. I asked why she hadn't published a book yet. She said she was waiting until she had something she wanted to say, not just images she wanted to show. On Friday, she called Juneau and accepted. I was sitting at her kitchen table when she did it. She looked at me once before she said yes, and I nodded, because I meant it, and because she needed to know I meant it. Not as permission, but as a fact. I was still here, regardless of what the next 8 months looked like. After the call, she put her phone down and didn't say anything for a while. "Hey," I said. "I'm okay. I know." She looked at her lock screen, the gray wolf at the edge of the frozen lake. "I'm going to want to see this when the satellite connection drops." I didn't have a useful response to that, so I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, and she turned her palm up and held on. We had 4 weeks before she drove to Portland for her connecting flight to Juneau. They were not a complete relationship. We both knew that. But they were honest in a way I hadn't expected, which made them feel like more than their length. We drove up to Astoria one weekend and walked across the bridge over the Columbia in wind, cold enough to feel personal. She made me stand still while she framed a shot of the span against stormlight, and when she showed me the image on her camera screen, I understood for the first time what she meant about having something to say. On her last night, we made dinner from things she needed to use up: half a bag of pasta, canned tomatoes, a block of Parmesan she'd been meaning to finish. It was not a romantic meal in any constructed sense. The cheese grater was broken, and I used a knife. Nina burned her thumb on the pan, ran it under cold water, and ate standing at the counter with her hands still damp while I finished the sauce. "This is going to be a terrible story to tell people," she said. "We sat on a tailgate in the snow in your pajamas. That part's good. This is the middle. Middles are always awkward." She looked at me over the counter. "What does the end look like?" I had been thinking about that since Juneau. Since, honestly, before Juneau. "Like you have a gallery show in a city we both want to be in," I said, "and I'm in the audience, and you're annoyed I got there early and took the wrong spot. That's oddly specific. You care about room layout, I've noticed." She set down her fork and came around the counter and stopped in front of me. "I'm not scared of the 8 months," she said. "I've been alone in worse places for longer. I'm scared it'll be easy to let this become something we tried." I understood what she meant. Not the distance, the drift. The slow conversion of something real into something you remember fondly. I had done it before. "Then we don't do that," I said. "I call when I say I'm going to call. You send me a picture when you get something you're proud of, not to perform happiness, but because I want to actually know what's happening out there. When we plan to visit, we book the flight first and work around it. And if the 8 months turns into longer, then we figure out what comes after 8 months." She searched my face. "You'd look at moving?" "I'd look at anything that put me on the same side of the country as you." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she put her arms around me, and I held her in the kitchen under a light that was too bright and completely beside the point. She stayed that night. We fell asleep on my couch, her head on my shoulder, a nature documentary on the television that she'd already seen twice and found comforting. My alarm went off at 5 because her first flight was at 8, and she'd been anxious about traffic. I made coffee while she finished packing the last things from her apartment. I carried 2 bags down to her car in the dark. In the parking lot, she stopped beside the exact spot where we'd sat on the tailgate. "I'm going to think about this parking lot for 8 months," she said. "It'll look better in the summer." She kissed me. Not the dramatic kind, the kind that feels like the beginning of a habit, which is the better kind. "Don't fix anything in my apartment while I'm gone," she said against my shoulder. Your bathroom light is going to go again. Let it. I watched her pull out of the lot. The sun wasn't up yet. The snow had melted enough that the pavement was visible again. Just gray asphalt and the salt residue the landlord's guy had spread the week before. Long distance is not a condition that makes itself cinematic from the inside. It was a Tuesday night call that got cut short when her satellite connection dropped during a particularly good conversation. It was her sending 37 photos from a calving event and me spending an hour on each one because I wanted to ask real questions when we talked. It was her laughing at me over video when I described a structural problem in a historic theater. You're describing a building the way I describe animals, you know that? It was me flying into Juneau in June with a carry-on that was mostly layers, spending 5 days in a landscape that made my sense of scale entirely irrelevant. She met me at the airport in the same wool socks from the parking lot. She wore them on purpose. At month 5, I started looking at what building inspection and structural consulting looked like in the Portland metro area, which was close enough to an airport with direct flights north to count as a reasonable next step. At month 6, I applied for a senior inspector position with the city of Portland and didn't tell her, because I didn't want it to feel like pressure. She called me in October and asked how I was doing with the coming winter. Better than last year, I said. Last year, you met me. That's what I said. She was quiet for a moment. I've been looking at gallery spaces for a show, the glacier work. My agent thinks late spring. Where? Portland. I felt something shift in my chest. Yeah? I was going to ask if you knew the city well enough to recommend neighborhoods with good light. I might be getting to know it better, I said. A pause. Jasper. I put in for a transfer 6 weeks ago. I didn't want to tell you until I knew. Did you? I got it. I start in January. What came through the phone then wasn't a word. It was the sound of someone who had been carrying something carefully for a very long time, finally setting it down. She flew into Portland in December to look at apartments and gallery spaces. I picked her up at PDX with the heat running because I knew she'd been traveling since 4 in the morning and would be cold. She got in, pulled the door shut, and looked around the cab like she was reorienting. This is different. Different how? I've only ever seen this truck in the snow. I pulled out of arrivals. I found an apartment near Hawthorne, 2 bedrooms, covered parking. She looked at me. That's very specific. Second bedroom could be a studio, west-facing windows. Good light until about 4. Jasper. I'm not suggesting week 1. I just thought you should know it existed before you signed anything. She looked out the windshield for a long time. Long enough that I checked her expression from the corner of my eye. She was wearing the look I recognized from the parking lot, the look of someone who has been waiting to put something down and has finally found the place to set it. Show me the listing, she said. I'm driving. Show me when you stop. Deal. We moved in the following March. Her best photographs went on the wall in the studio. The west-facing room I'd identified months before, which turned out to be exactly what she needed. The Yellowstone wolf went above her editing desk. My inspection tools went in the garage. She grew very attached to having a garage. I did not point this out. The gallery show opened in May. The main image was the calving glacier, a 100-foot wall of blue-white ice caught in the exact second of separation, the water below already reacting before the ice had finished falling. She had been in a zodiac 40 meters away when she took it. She told me this on opening night in the voice she used for facts about other people's lives. Were you scared? I asked. The whole time, she said. I didn't think about it until after. That sounded right to me. Most things worth doing work that way. That November, on the first real cold night of the season, Nina came out to where I was sitting on our covered back steps. She opened her jacket, underneath. Green plaid flannel pajamas. She had ordered them specifically in the right pattern from the same brand. She held out a can of Rainier. It's cold, I said. The stars are good. I took the beer. We sat on the steps until we couldn't feel our feet, talking about nothing consequential and everything that mattered. At some point, she leaned her head against my shoulder in the way that had become completely ordinary and remained, somehow, something I noticed every single time. I thought about all the careful reasons I had once assembled to keep myself exactly where I was, watching a life from a 12-foot distance and calling it wisdom. I thought about a parking lot in January and a can of beer pulled from a coat pocket with the patience of someone who had already decided to wait me out. I had been a slow learner. Nina was, apparently, willing to teach. What would you have done if you found out someone staged a whole situation just to spend time with you? Have you ever been on either side of that? The one waiting or the one too careful to see it? Tell me your story in the comments. And for those who'd like to be a little closer to us here at Whispered Barely, we've opened memberships where you'll get shorter, exclusive stories every week with no ads. Just the story, start to finish. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.